This weapon is a single-shot, disposable rocket launcher. It weighs 5.5 pounds. It costs less than $2,000. It was designed in 1959. The United States military has tried to replace it twice. Both times, the replacement failed. The second time, the military ended up with a different weapon entirely, and kept the original anyway. Right now, in 2026, the M72 LAW is still in production, still in the hands of American operators, being shipped by the thousands to a war in Ukraine, being ordered in new variants for threats its designers never imagined. And when you understand what happened the one time the military thought it was finally done, in the rubble of a city in Iraq where Marines discovered something the procurement system never saw coming, you'll understand why a 66-year-old disposable tube from the Eisenhower era refuses to die. To understand the law, you have to understand what infantrymen were carrying before it existed, and how badly the Army wanted to get rid of it. After World War II, the standard American anti-tank weapon for the individual soldier was the M20 Super Bazooka. 3.5 inches of rocket launcher, 14 pounds unloaded, 60 inches long, 5 feet from end to end. It took 2 men to operate effectively, a dedicated gunner and a loader, working in coordination, crouched behind cover, trying not to get their heads taken off while threading a rocket into the breach under fire. To carry it into combat was to announce yourself. To set it up was to burn seconds you didn't have. It worked! But it was a weapon designed for a different era of warfare. Static, positional, armor rolling across open fields and known corridors. The Army of the late 1950s was planning for a different kind of fight. In 1956, the requirement went out. Design a lightweight anti-tank weapon that a single soldier could carry, operate alone, and discard after firing. Something that gave every man in the squad a personal rocket without the weight, the bulk, or the 2-man crew. The logic was borrowed from the Germans. During World War II, the Wehrmacht had solved the same problem with the Panzerfaust, a cheap, disposable, single-shot rocket that could be issued by the thousands and put anti-armor firepower in the hands of any soldier who needed it. The Americans wanted the same thing, with better range and better reliability. Work began at Redstone Arsenal in 1959. Engineers at Hess Eastern developed a new solid rocket motor, compact enough to fit inside a telescoping, 2-piece tube that also served as the launch container and the waterproof storage case. The inner tube slid rearward to extend the weapon for firing, and when it did, the front and rear sights snapped up automatically. There were no moving parts to maintain, no battery to die, no complicated assembly under stress. To prepare it to fire, a soldier extended the tube and pulled a trigger. That was it. In 1963, it entered service with the U.S. Army and Marine Corps. They called it the M72 Light Anti-Tank Weapon, the LAW. What happened next was not the triumphant combat debut anyone had planned. February 7, 1968. Lang Vei Special Forces Camp, South Vietnam. 11 Soviet-built PT-76 light tanks are rolling out of the darkness toward the wire. The 12 Americans and several hundred Montagnard fighters inside the camp had 100 M72 LAWs between them. It should have been enough. A tank hit squarely by a rocket round from a 66mm heat warhead at close range was a kill. On paper. What followed was a nightmare. The rockets misfired. They launched and failed to detonate. Some exploded in flight short of the target, sometimes injuring the men who fired them. Some tubes couldn't be armed at all. Green Berets in the fighting positions were cycling through law after law, pulling triggers on tubes that did nothing, while 11 tanks ground through their defenses. The camp fell. 14 Americans were killed or missing. The investigation pointed to a brutal irony. The tanks had rolled in close, inside the law's minimum arming distance of 33 feet. Rockets that struck the PT-76s at that range simply hadn't traveled far enough to arm. They hit the armor and did nothing. Separately, the broader Vietnam-era service exposed a distinct problem. Some warheads were detonating in flight before reaching the target. The Army recalled and modified the entire inventory, returning corrected tubes stenciled with the marking, "with coupler." But the damage wasn't just mechanical. The reputation of the M72 had taken a wound that would follow it for a generation. Soldiers who had watched the weapon fail them at the worst possible moment didn't forget. The institutional memory of Langvay lived in after-action reports and mess hall conversations for years. The law became the rocket that couldn't stop tanks. What that reputation missed was the other story. The one happening every day in the jungles and streets and fortified villages of Vietnam that never made it into the official narrative of a single catastrophic night. Because in every other kind of target the law was asked to engage, it was devastating. Bunkers, fortified fighting positions, concrete walls, machine gun nests dug into hillsides, trench lines with timber overhead cover. The 66mm heat round didn't need to kill a main battle tank to be lethal. It needed to be pointed at something solid and fired. Marines credited it with neutralizing Viet Cong mortar pits and machine gun emplacements that could not be flanked. During the 1968 Battle of Hue, urban fighting in a city of temples and thick walls, the law went through structures that stopped rifle fire cold. The Army looked at that record and drew two conclusions simultaneously. The first was that the M72 needed to be improved against armor. The second was that it needed to be replaced before the improvement became permanent. In the late 1970s, the Army began developing what they called the FGR-17 Viper, a shoulder-fired rocket launcher specifically designed to replace the M72 once and for all. More range, better penetration against Soviet armor, modern fusing. The program moved forward, hardware was produced, and then, in 1982, it collapsed. Reports came back from testing that the Viper had a catastrophic flaw. In certain conditions, the rocket could detonate on launch, killing the operator. The static electricity problem, the same basic category of failure that had plagued early rocket weapons, had not been fully solved. Congress canceled the program. The money was gone, and the Army was back where it started. With no domestic replacement available, Congress ordered the Army to evaluate off-the-shelf systems. They looked at several candidates, and in 1985 selected the AT-4, a Swedish-designed rocket launcher built by Bofors, manufactured under license in the United States as the M136. The AT-4 was heavier than the law, longer than the law, more expensive than the law, but it was significantly more lethal against modern armor. Better penetration, better range, better hit probability on moving targets at distance. The AT-4 became the official replacement. The M72 was declared surplus. The transition began. And then arithmetic intervened. The AT-4, fully loaded, weighs 15 pounds. The M72 weighs less than 6. A soldier on full combat load could strap 2 LAWs to his ruck for the weight of a single AT-4. Against an enemy who moved in pickup trucks, occupied buildings, and hid in fortified rooms, rather than advancing in tank formations across open ground, which described almost every enemy American soldiers would actually fight for the next 40 years, that weight equation had a direct impact on what happened in contact. The law was never formally restored to service. It was never formally removed either. The supply chain kept running. The tubes kept accumulating in armories. And then, the world changed. November 2004, Operation Phantom Fury. The largest urban battle American forces had fought since Hue City in 1968. 12,000 Marines, soldiers, and allied Iraqi troops fighting house to house through a city of 300,000 people against an enemy that had spent months turning every block into a fortress. The insurgents in Fallujah had converted the dense urban grid into a killing ground. They punched holes through the walls between houses so they could move without exposing themselves to the street. They booby-trapped doors. They set up interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. They didn't need tanks. They had concrete. Marines quickly learned that knocking on a door was a way to die. The buildings themselves were the threat. Thick-walled, interconnected structures that absorbed small arms fire and gave the defenders inside virtually unlimited time to set up the next ambush. The solution was to go through the walls. Not the doors, the walls. The AT-4 could do it, but the AT-4 weighed 15 pounds, and a Marine doing 12-hour rotations through house-to-house fighting in full kit couldn't carry unlimited weight. Every pound that went to breaching was a pound that didn't go to rifle ammunition, water, or medical gear. The M72 LAW, 5.5 pounds, 25 inches collapsed, small enough to sling over a shoulder and forget until it was needed, could put a rocket through a concrete block wall and create a breach point. And the newer variants, the M72 A6 and A7, had been updated with a different warhead specifically designed for exactly this kind of target. Not anti-armor penetration, but blast effect against structures. The warhead that had struggled against the PT-76 at Langve had been redesigned around a new mission. Walls, rooms, buildings, the places where the actual enemy of 2004 actually lived. Marines brought them back out. An Army after-action assessment from the 10th Mountain Division in 2010, after similar urban fighting in Afghanistan, put it in plain language. The M72 provided the best balance of weight to combat effectiveness of any weapon in the inventory. Fast to deploy, accurate at close range, light enough to carry multiples, lethal against exactly the targets they were actually engaging. The procurement system had spent 20 years trying to replace a weapon that the people using it already knew they needed. The M72 LAW in production today looks nothing like the tube that failed at Langve in 1968. The silhouette is the same. Everything else has been rebuilt. The M72 A9, which the British designated the light anti-structure munition after reintroducing it specifically for Afghanistan, carries a penetrating delay fuse designed to punch through a wall before detonating inside. The M72 fire-from-enclosure variants can be fired from inside a building, eliminating the backblast danger that previously required operators to be outside or in open space. The modern production versions come off the line in Norway, at Nammo's facility in Raufoss, and in Arizona, at Nammo Tally. Canada supplied around 4,500 M72s to Ukrainian forces fighting Russian armor and fortified positions in eastern Ukraine. Norway donated 5,000 from reserve stocks. Denmark contributed its own supply before formally retiring the weapon. The same light, cheap, disposable rocket that was declared obsolete against Soviet armor in the 1980s is now being fired at Russian-built armor and fortified trenches by Ukrainian soldiers, in a war that looks, in some stretches of front, more like 1917 than 2024. In the actual wars human beings fight, not the armored division engagements that procurement was always preparing for, what matters is what a man can carry into a building at 3 in the morning. A weapon he can set up in seconds and fire alone is worth more than a heavier system left in the armory, because nobody could carry both. The law is a fraction of the cost of a Javelin missile. Both have their place, but when a Marine needs to breach a wall in a building full of people who want to kill him, and he needs to do it right now, in the dark, with whatever is on his body, the answer was never the Javelin. It was the 5.5-pound tube he picked up at the armory that morning and forgot about until he needed it. There is a category of weapons that military bureaucracies are always trying to replace. They're too simple, too cheap, too light, too limited against the specific threat the current threat assessment says to prepare for. And then a war starts, and the men who have to fight it reach for the thing that works in the situation they're actually in, not the one on the chart. The M72 LAW has outlasted 2 dedicated replacement programs. declared obsolete, surplus, and redundant, then pulled out of storage, reintroduced, upgraded, and shipped to active combat zones in 3 different decades. The engineers at Redstone Arsenal in 1959 asked a simple question: how do you give every soldier in the squad a rocket he can actually carry? They answered it with a telescoping fiberglass tube and 5.5 pounds of rocket science. 66 years later, factories in Norway and Arizona are still running, because nobody has found a better answer to the question. And in the places where the answer matters, nobody's stopped asking it. If this is the kind of depth you're looking for, the engineering, the battlefield, the reason things survived when they weren't supposed to, subscribe. There's a lot more coming.